Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book launch for The Resistance Dilemma, Place-Based Movements and the Climate Crisis, authored by Dr. George Hoberg. Today's book launch is being hosted by the University of British Columbia School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, known as SPPGA. My name is Sarah Fraze, and I'm a graduate of the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program, where I was actually fortunate to have the opportunity to do some research with Dr. Hoberg during my time there. Currently, I work as a policy analyst with the BC Assembly of First Nations. To start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, where the UBC Vancouver campus and the SPPGA is located. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ancestral territories where I am calling in from today, which is the territory of the Lekwungen, Esquimalt, Chanu, and Souk First Nations. And I would just like to invite everyone joining us here today to take a moment to acknowledge the lands and territories where you are joining from. And you can just take a moment to do that in your own space. So thank you for joining me in that. A few housekeeping notes. This event will be recorded and later posted on the SPPGA website, so you can always go back and find it there. And you are welcome to ask questions by typing them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and that will become especially important when we arrive at the Q&A portion of our time together later today. So with that, I'd like to introduce the book's author, Dr. George Hoberg, professor at SPPGA and the graduate program director of the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program. He specializes in environmental and natural resource policy and governance, and his research interests include environmental policy, energy policy, forest policy, and more generally, the design of policies and institutions to promote sustainability. His current research focuses on the clean energy transformation. I'd also like to introduce Sephora Berman, an adjunct professor of environmental studies at York University, the international program director at Stand.Earth, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, the co-founder of the Global Oil and Gas Network, and the former co-director of Greenpeace International's Climate and Energy Program. She has been designing environmental advocacy campaigns and environmental policy for 30 years. She has held appointed positions advising the BC government on climate policy and was appointed by the Alberta government to co-chair the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group, tasked with making recommendations to implement climate change and cumulative impact policies in the oil sands. We are thrilled that you're here with us today. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hoberg.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And it's so great to have you introduce us after working with me on part of this book. I'm going to share a screen here quickly. It's so good to finally be here and be able to talk about having this thing completed. The first decade of the 21st century was quite a hard one for climate activists in North America. Despite escalating evidence for the dangers of global warming and increasing sense of urgency that it was a decade we couldn't afford to lose, politics seemed stuck. For most of the decade, the White House was occupied by George W. Bush, who pushed back on climate science and had no interest in climate action. In Canada, 2006 saw the rise to the power of Stephen Harper to prime minister, where he was for 10 years, a vigorous defender of Canada's oil industry. New hope emerged in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, but that was quickly dashed when ambitious climate legislation was defeated in the US Congress, and the Copenhagen Summit in 2009 ended in bitter defeat. This book tells the story of the climate movement's shift in strategy from lobbying for better national and international policy to block fuel infrastructure. Why did we do that? The reason that the environmentalists chose to do that is because of how complicated the climate challenge is as a policy problem. The structure of climate change as a problem creates a distinctive challenges to social movement mobilization because the costs and benefits of taking action are separated both over space and over time. Costs are in the here and now, and benefits are global and distant in time. That makes it very hard to motivate people to act urgently on an issue like that. Mobilization is much easier if you can shift attention to concrete local issues, which is perfectly reflected in the poster you see there. The reason that British Columbian activists, including climate activists, focus so intently on tankers was not because they weren't mostly concerned about the climate. It was because that was the thing that resonated with voters the most. The book looks at 4 pipeline cases. The first one out of the gate was the Keystone XL pipeline. That's the one that goes here from the Edmonton area of the oil sands down to Cushing, Oklahoma. After 13 years of protracted conflict, it was originally first canceled by Barack Obama back in 2011, but it kept rising again. Trump reapproved it at one point, even though Obama tried to kill it twice. But finally, once Biden was elected, it's now officially dead. So that's been canceled. The next one was Northern Gateway Pipeline from the Edmonton area to our coast here in British Columbia up in the north. It was going to go to Kitimat. It was canceled because of vehement opposition from First Nations groups, a very strong judicial ruling that consultation and accommodation measures had been inadequate, and finally cancellation of it by the Trudeau government. Energy East, which was the next big initiative to go out, which would have gone from Edmonton all the way to New Brunswick, ran into trouble because it went through the province of Quebec, which had no interest in hosting an oil pipeline. After a great deal of conflict, it was withdrawn by the proponent, TransCanada, now called TC Energy. The one remaining pipeline, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project that goes from here in Edmonton to our backyard in Burnaby, is the one that is likely to come into operation. Tree sitters were just removed yesterday. We don't know whether there will be continuing on the ground resistance, but the pipeline seems increasingly likely to be constructed. One of the reasons why that's the sole survivor is because the fact that it was built mostly on top of existing infrastructure. There was a previously existing pipeline running from Edmonton to Burnaby, makes it easier to overcome resistance. And we can talk more about that if you want. You know, I'm sorry, I did manage to skip over a slide here. I just wanted to make clear that the book is centered around 4 core questions. The first of which is how effective has that place-based resistance been to fossil fuel, the place-based resistance to fossil fuels been at promoting climate action policies. And so the first step in showing that they've been effective is by showing that 3 out of the 4 pipelines that the groups targeted have been canceled. Only one remains. The second part of that argument is to look at their impacts on climate policy. And this is the 2 significant movers in climate policy, Rachel Notley, the ex-premier of Alberta, and I'm sure you recognize the Prime Minister of Canada there, who's been in place since 2015. This resistance created significant economic pain for the oil sector by making it harder for products to get to the market and creating a differential between international prices and domestic prices, which led to lost revenue and a lot of financial concern. It also led to a lot of political pain in the sense that because environmental groups and indigenous groups kept winning by blocking pipelines, the reputation of the oil sands as a sustainable product declined precipitously. In 2015, new governments with a more strategic outlook towards climate action were elected in Alberta and Canada, and they adopted more progressive policies. First in November of 2015 in Alberta, and then in 2016 in Canada. In both cases, explicit linkages were made to pipelines, the pipeline conflicts. When Rachel Notley announced her climate policies, the Climate Leadership Plan in November of 2015, she said, I'm hopeful that these policies taken overall will lead to a new collaborative conversation about Canada's infrastructure on its merits and to a significant de-escalation of conflict worldwide about Alberta oil sands. When Trudeau introduced the Pan-Canadian framework and subsequently discussed why he did that 2 years later, he said, in order to get the National Climate Change Plan, to get Alberta to be part of it, and we need Alberta to be part of it, we agreed to twin an existing pipeline. That's the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Yes, they were linked to each other. So pipeline opposition, effective opposition, forced governments to adopt more effective climate policy. That's the first question. The second question is, does that strategy risk the unintended consequences of feeding place-based resistance to the clean energy transformation? And that's where the title of the book comes from, The Resistance Dilemma. This isn't a pipeline protest. This is a high voltage transmission line protest. The resistance dilemma suggests that the institutions and norms that give local authorities the ability to block dirty energy infrastructure also give them the authority to block clean energy infrastructure and potentially clean energy policies. And that could risk our ability to undertake an effective clean energy transformation. So what chapters 9 and 10 of the book do is look at a series of clean energy controversies and show that in fact, environmental and indigenous resistance to those projects increased project costs in a number of cases, led to significant delays, and in multiple cases led to outright cancellations. That includes a lot of the wind projects in Ontario. It includes a very significant progressive offshore wind project in Massachusetts, the Cape Shore wind project. It includes a significant concentrated solar photovoltaic facility in California, and it includes the Northern Pass Transmission Project, which would have taken carbon-free hydropower from Quebec and taken it across the border to help the New England states decarbonize and get off natural gas and coal. So that's the second question. I'm not going to go into any details on the third and fourth question. Is there hope in new innovative processes in promoting social acceptance of the rapid transition of the clean energy system? The answer to that, that's chapter 11 of the book, is absolutely yes. When you engage deeper and move away from thinking about specific projects and take on a more strategic approach to engaging the public, you can be successful. And the final question is, why, if that's true, why haven't we done more of it? And in the last chapter of the book, I developed a little political model showing that there's significant political disincentives for governments to do that. They don't want to give up control of the process, and they don't want to do the investment in the time and energy necessary to do those deeper engagement processes, even though they would probably pay off if they did so. So that's the main argument of the book. Place-based resistance against pipelines had evident impacts on emissions and climate policy. Strengthening the institutional muscles for place-based groups to block infrastructure does create risks that needed clean energy projects will be delayed or canceled. We don't just have a climate crisis, we have a process crisis. There is hope that more innovative processes can overcome that place-based resistance, but the political incentives of those who make decisions about engagement processes helps explain the reluctance of policymakers to adopt the types of processes that analysts recommend. So that's a very quick overview of the take that this academic has made on this topic. I wanted to do this book launch by inviting Sephora Berman to join me, because I thought it'd be useful, rather than just listening to an academic talk about these things, to actually engage in a conversation with the practitioner who's done, strategized, led, and did these things over the past, 15 years or so. And so I wanted to begin by talking about the origin story of this, this strategy. In chapter 2, talk about the fact that while we normally think of the strategy as beginning when the Keystone XL pipeline conflicts began with the White House in 2011, in fact, a group of Canadian environmentalists got together in 2005 in Alberta and launched something called the Upstream Strategy Working Group, that once you go back and read it, it sounds just like the strategy that's been playing out for the past 15 years. And when you think about the fact that that strategy has been in place for that long, it makes it seem like these 4 pipeline campaigns that never seem particularly connected to each other all seem much more coordinated than I think people widely believe. In fact, Sephora, one of your colleagues told me in an interview that it was all one campaign. I'm wondering if you agree with that.
Thanks, George, and thank you so much for having me. It was such a fascinating process last night, reading your book in prep for this. It was a little bit like watching my life flash before my eyes for the last over a decade. I appreciate you asking me to join you. It's a great book, and I think we have so much to learn from the last decade. I was super excited to see you go into the clean energy piece and how we can better engage communities. And we'll get to that. Was it one campaign? No, it wasn't one campaign. We tried hard to connect the dots so that we were one movement. So yes, there was a strategy, several strategy sessions in Alberta in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, where we talked about the need to build power and against this industry, which was on a juggernaut. And of course, with Harper saying he wanted to triple the size of the oil sands and become an energy superpower based on oil. And so we all saw the threat coming, and we were trying to figure out what is a way where you can really slow down the system. And the infrastructure seemed clear. I mean, Alberta is landlocked, and if you're going to expand, you need more infrastructure. But the strategy was kind of a wing and a prayer. I mean, like, it made sense intellectually, and I thought it was a great strategy. And actually making it happen is a whole nother thing. And what happened in the coming years was some hard work to connect the dots and get people talking to each other. Like, I can remember incredible meetings where the Yankee Dene from Northern Gateway were meeting with the Nebraska farmers from the Keystone campaign, and they were sharing strategies and sharing information. And then there were folks there from the Athabasca Chippewan, and they were telling about what they're experiencing on the land. And so we tried to really knit together the movement through gatherings, through strategy sessions, through sharing of information, so we could be greater than the sum of our parts, I guess. But really, having been involved now in, I guess, 5, 6 pipeline campaigns, each one of them is led on the ground by the people who are on the ground. So they're very different campaigns. They come from different, they come for different reasons. In some ways, the environmental movement or the climate justice movement leaning into some of these pipeline campaigns created a perfect storm for decision makers, because they were about everything. For some people, it's about oil spills. It's about their drinking water. For some people, it's about eminent domain. It's about their farms being just put a pipeline through their farms. And for other people, it was about treaty rights, trapping rights, and risks of oil spills. And then we knitted all of those things together. But what was really interesting to me about becoming one movement is that we all went on a journey. Like, I had better understand eminent domain and the rights of and those concerns. Private interests in this. I better understand local concerns. I think I better understand Indigenous treaty rights now as a result of all those years of working together. And I think I've had lots of great conversations with Nebraskan farmers where they were like, I thought you guys were whacked out on this climate change thing until I spent a year in the campaign and read all that stuff. And now I'm like, we've got to stop the oil. And so they became climate campaigners through the process. So I think through the process, we become more one, but it really was a lot of diverse interests and a lot of diverse campaigns that we were trying to knit together.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I summarized in my very brief talk, I talk a lot more about it in the book in chapter 8, that the anti-pipeline campaign really has been effective at constraining the growth of emissions and particularly enforcing governments to adopt more ambitious climate policy in Canada. But I also say in chapter 8 that the resistance movement's rise in power elicited a formidable political counterattack by a political giant caught off guard. Some other academics, Shane Gunster up at SFU, referred to that as a Petro populist backlash. And it's taken the form of constitutional challenges to the carbon tax, McCarthy-like inquiries into anti-Alberta activities, and very nasty turn in social discourse about energy and climate policy that I know you've been the brunt a lot of. Could we have made progress differently to avoid such a vehement backlash, or was it inevitable? And do you think it's peaked?
Those are really exciting, fascinating questions. Could we have avoided it? I would say yes and no. The yes is that when I look at the trajectory, and I really hadn't done this until I read your book, which I really encourage people to read. It was such an incredible journey. But like looking back like that over a decade of those campaigns, I wish that we had had the resources and there had been more groups leaning in to do competitiveness studies, economic diversification studies, to propose actual projects that could help build an economic base for Alberta so that the transition isn't so scary. But so what happened is, the campaign grew to basically call for an end to oil expansion and a wind down and stop all these pipelines. And it landed in a way that there was no obvious solution to it. And so people feel and felt really threatened. And so, but is there a solution? Sure, there's a solution. And we're seeing it happen in many regions of the world. We need serious competitiveness studies that look at what are we good at and what are the markets that are taking off. And so where should we lean in to put our billions of dollars instead of wasting it, for example, with Premier Kenney putting billions of dollars into the Keystone Pipeline or millions of dollars into the war room. That money could be going to other industries to give them tax breaks, to give them the leg up, to design programs to employ more people and grow this aspect of the economy, whatever it is, food production, film production, and clean tech, high tech. And we're not doing that. We don't have an economic strategy because we're still pretending like the wind down of the fossil fuel industry isn't going to happen. So should the environmental movement have leaned more into tangible proposals and tangible competitiveness studies? Probably. But that stuff's really expensive. And the arm of the environmental movement that really does protests and runs campaigns is not the same as the arm of the environmental movement that is a think tank, it produces reports, etc. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect there, because those of us, Indigenous groups and frontline groups and environmental groups that have run these pipeline campaigns, most of us are not at all funded in Canada and don't have support of a lot of the climate opinion leaders in the country. And that work is far more focused just on the demand side of the equation, and in building renewables and reducing emissions, but not in replacing whole sections of our economy. And the no to that question is that every place I've worked in the world and looked at has this backlash now. And I think I see it as the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. We're in this strange situation where the science is telling us, and also our countries are signing off on plans to get rid of the fossil fuel industry, to go to zero, to wind it all down. And the fossil fuel industry and a lot of companies are fighting for their lives. They all want to be the last barrel standing in a world that's getting rid of their products altogether. And so that's not going to be easy. And there's going to be a backlash, but I think there could have been less of a backlash if we had really focused on solution. And I also think there could have been less of a backlash if we had had better language. Like when I started talking about tar sands, I was like, Mordor, dirtiest, disgusting place on earth. These people are bad people. And it was really black and white to me. Like, we can't be doing this. And it was after spending more time in Alberta that I realized, I was like, there's over 100,000 people, and I'm making them feel like terrible. And if we start from a place of common purpose, which I learned the hard way in Alberta, like, we didn't know what we know today about climate change, about cumulative impacts of the tar sands when we started building the tar sands, and we have all benefited from the fossil fuel era. But now we know. So what are we going to do together? How are we going to fix this problem? That wasn't our messaging or framing. And so we got a lot of people with their backs up against the walls, and I think that fed the opposition.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a natural progress of a campaign and a movement, I guess, that you have to establish your power first by pushing against the existing powers. Solving their problems is kind of a next stage, and maybe we should have gotten going on that a little bit earlier. It's been very gratifying that the Supreme Court of Canada has upheld the federal government's authority to impose carbon pricing on the provinces. I think that one of the greatest contributions of the pipeline campaigns has been to kind of create the space and political force for the Trudeau government to actually increase the role of the federal government in climate policy. That's been great. But we really have yet to talk about or address what I'll just generally refer to as the Alberta problem, which is exactly related to what you were talking about. The need to design a strategy to transition oil-dependent communities and industries away from oil or natural gas. And it's pretty clear that the rest of Canada is kind of ready for this. And the Trudeau government certainly has been signaling this with its net zero commitment, which has been around for 18 months or so. But the government of Alberta just doesn't seem to be on the same page. And the oil industry uses the term net zero now, but in a way that seems very disingenuous, in the sense that they seem to think that they can create a barrel of oil that doesn't produce any carbon, but the production of it doesn't produce any carbon, but that barrel of oil is going to go somewhere where it produces lots of carbon when it's combusted in trucks and cars, et cetera. So I'm just curious if you have any ideas of how we can tackle this massive Alberta problem.
Well, that's such a huge question. I mean, I think part of it really is facing the truth as a nation. And again, the common purpose of, okay, let's all come together and figure out what the solution for Alberta is. Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, it's going to be harder, to phase out the fossil fuel industry. We know that, because our challenge as a nation is not about how much fossil fuels we use, it's about how much we produce and export. So how do we replace those export revenues? How do we make sure that we keep our economies whole while we phase it out? We're not actually even having that conversation yet as a nation, because I feel like we've gone from denial about climate change to delusion. This question of we can just somehow keep producing oil and still make it to net zero because there will be offsets and we'll plant more trees and we'll do more carbon capture and storage, but the math doesn't add up. We've been pouring money as a nation, our governments as well as companies, into carbon capture and storage now for well over a decade, and so have many other nations around the world, and it's not working. It's not working at scale, and it's not cost competitive. And yes, we need nature to store more carbon, and we need nature-based solutions, but we need to get to zero fossil fuels first. And then we also need to draw down carbon that is stuck in the atmosphere from using nature-based solutions. The science is showing us that the time for offsets is actually over. We need to actually just stop building more of the problem. And so I think that the way that we have to get to that is through addressing common purpose and addressing it head on and making a plan. I was actually encouraged in this last election that the Liberal government said, talked about just transition, not just for coal, but also for oil and gas, and also talked about a cap on oil and gas emissions. I mean, this is the baby steps of actually saying, guys, we can't keep producing it forever, and everybody's afraid to say it. And when you do say it, it's hard. You get death threats, you get attacked by your own people who you thought were your people. I'll never forget this one conference I was at, and I said, but what are we doing to reduce the expansion of production? We can't say we're in transition if we keep building more of the thing we're trying to transition out of. And this certain person who works in government turned to me quietly and he said, I think you've just got to stop talking about fossil fuel expansion when we talk about climate change, because it's rude. And I thought, oh my God, it's rude. Like, it's that 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere come from coal, oil, or gas. And in this country, we're so polite. We pretend like it's okay. Not, we're just not going to talk about, we're going to talk about emissions, but we're not going to talk about the oil and gas sector. We actually just need to start talking about it and learning from our past. I mean, I want to ask you a question on that note, George.
Okay.
Your book, which is, when you delved so deeply into all of these case studies, which you did for a long time, right? Like, how long did it take you to write this book? It was years, 6 years or something?
Why do you say that? Yes.
Because it's a lot of work.
It was a labor of love. It was a struggle. It was a long time.
But so what were the things that surprised you, that you're like, oh, that really did impact that I didn't really realize that. What were the things you learned that you didn't know going in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that you said that it wasn't all one campaign, and I accept that it was one movement and multiple campaigns, and the campaigns were all about different things. But I was not aware of the level of coordination among the campaigns that was existing. I was not aware, and I was very proud of the fact that I believe I'm the first publication to tell the story of the Upstream Strategy Working Group. Because it's very interesting, right? Because the inquiry going on into anti-Alberta energy activities under the Kenney government doesn't seem to have figured this stuff out either. They all think it's some grand conspiracy of American foundations, as opposed to the fact that it's a group of friends in the environmental movement getting together and talking about how to contain the expansion of the oil sands. So that's one thing that interested me. And some of the stuff you already said about the relationships among the people primarily interested in climate and the people primarily interested in protecting local values, whether or not that is the coast from tankers, a precious aquifer from a pipeline rupture, or the rights of indigenous groups to have the consent and control over their own lands. And one of the things I wanted to bring up that we didn't talk about earlier, the demand that climate be included in discussions of pipelines and infrastructure was ultimately successful, and we made progress. We have a lot of work to do on climate policy, but we now actually have a lot of momentum behind climate policy in Canada, especially at the federal level. We also did something extraordinary. I shouldn't say we. Something extraordinary has happened on Indigenous rights, because a lot of the efforts to team up with Indigenous groups was specifically designed to make sure that those groups had the right to consent, as they should under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that seemed pretty fanciful 5 years ago, and now it's law in British Columbia and in Canada, and that's extraordinary. So it's a lot of the things that inspired me to begin the research on the book have in fact come true in a way that's positive. And it does suggest that it takes a really long time to write a book. It takes a really long time to make political change, but those things get, making political change can actually happen.
Yeah, it can. The journey along that route was so fascinating. I've always wondered why no one has really written on this. But we've come a long way as an environmental movement in terms of Indigenous rights in the last decade, and it was not an easy journey. It was a painful journey, and it should be, because ultimately you're addressing the issues of racism and colonialism within your organizations, within the way you talk or frame an issue, what and issues of power, and we cracked all that open, and there was everything from, we'd have strategy meetings and all the food would be vegan. And I can remember Indigenous leaders coming in and going, I can't do this for 3 days. Like literally my body won't accept it. Like I live on meat, I live on fish and, and this, but it was from the little micro things to the big things. And we did it internally and had those conversations within the movement and made conscious decisions that we were campaigning and supporting and lifting up Indigenous rights simultaneously while fighting for climate change. And that was part of climate justice, and that was part of the pipeline movement. And it was true with local decisions too. In a lot of local campaigns, we had big arguments about like, well, should that ad talk about oil spills in drinking water, or should it talk about climate change? And we had to have the hard conversations and listen to each other, and then actually make agreements together. And that is a little window into, I think, what our government should be doing at a local level for true consultation.
Right. So there is one more big topic that I need to get your spin on, your views on, before we turn things over to the audience for questions. And audience, please get questions into the Q&A forum, and we can get after them in a couple of minutes. But really the frame of the book around the resistance dilemma is something that I wanted to get your views on. I make the argument that the effectiveness of the anti-fossil fuel infrastructure campaign might inadvertently make building clean energy infrastructure harder. I was wondering what your thoughts about that argument are.
In fact, when we were designing the pipeline campaigns, we were learning from the wind turbine protests. And I remember actually like studying it, like looking at what was happening on the East Coast of the US and in Ontario at the time too, in the early 2007 or 6 or 7. And the power of those grassroots community protests. And I said, we should be doing more of this on fossil fuel infrastructure. We should be engaging communities like this on fossil fuel infrastructure. So we actually were learning from them a little bit. I think that the resistance dilemma is real. I think a lot of the solutions that you point to of what governments could be doing and industry could be doing, which yes, takes time and it takes money. But I actually think when they don't do those good processes, it takes more time and money. The resistance does, right? I mean, every single pipeline in this country has been delayed or canceled because of resistance. So that takes time too. But I don't think that we build the same institutional, social, and cultural muscle, actually. I think there are different groups of people. And I think that and that they have different networks. Like a lot of the clean energy movements that I studied and the protests, they're really going at a ground level to like Rotary clubs and like the way they build power and the way that they build interest in a local community is actually very different from what I've seen from pipeline campaigns. And I think one of the differences in Canada might be that a lot of the leadership at a local level and on the pipelines is Indigenous in British Columbia for sure. And I think that, I'm not sure. I would have to look at, but I'm not sure that we're building the same muscle. I think both are learning from each other, so that's true. And I do think the resistance dilemma is really real. I mean, I faced it here in British Columbia on renewable energy projects in the early 2000s. When I had my climate reckoning about 20 years ago, I wanted to ensure that BC built as much renewable energy as quickly as possible. Because if we're going to get off fossil fuels for transportation, we have to replace all of that fossil fuels with something else. And I didn't want to see something like Site C built in that large scale. So I was really a proponent of small scale renewable energy. And some people listening might remember all the big IPP fights where a big portion of the environmental movement came out against me because they didn't want small renewable energy projects across the province. They didn't want run of river for sure. And that was a terrible time. And it was also really difficult. And it was a good example of the resistance dilemma, the run of river work in BC, because I think we have less renewable energy projects and less, and I think there actually are more First Nations being forced to support logging and fossil fuel development now because they don't have the economic revenue from the projects that they were going to build, which were renewable energy or wind.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And in the preface, I actually talk about where the idea from the book originally came from, because I was, while you were involved in that, I was doing academic research studying those run of the river protests. At the same time, I was beginning to look into oil sands expansion and pipeline stuff. And that's where the idea of kind of bringing these together into the same work was first hatched. But that was really good for this stage of today's event. We're going to now open things up to audience questions and answers for both of us. So Sarah, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Hoberg and Flora, for bringing us through that portion of today's event. Really good to hear that discussion. So we've received some questions from those who are gathered with us here today. And if you are still considering a question, please feel free to think that over and put your question in the Zoom Q&A function. And we'll aim to get through as many questions as we have time for today. So the first question that I want to pose to either George or Flora or both of yourselves is, have any of the larger quote unquote civil society organizations such as the NRDC, Sierra Club, etc., working on climate action engaged with these place-based movements? If so, what is their role? For example, promoting the cause more widely or coordinating groups? If not, why do these groups not prefer to work together? So a couple questions in there for your consideration.
Sapora, I think you should start, and I can chime in on that if I have any additional information.
They do, and some to a greater or lesser extent. I think some of the best work I've ever seen is with Sierra Club US, working with local communities across the US to stop coal plants. And part of what Sierra Club did there is to provide training and sometimes even funding and infrastructure to network those groups together so they could learn from them, so those campaigns could learn from them. Amplification, we often talk in the bigger groups. I think of STAND as one of the bigger groups considering how many grassroots groups we work with. But STAND, Sierra Club, I would say NRDC, we often talk about how we can amplify local voices. Not taking away local voices, and that's really important, but providing them opportunities to speak. If we're going to do a webinar on oil sands or tar sands, then we're going to have someone there from the Athabasca Chippewa, and we're going to have someone there from, you know, Pipe Up Burnaby or one of those small groups who are opposing one of the pipelines, to make sure that we lift up and amplify their voices. And when they do something, like what's happening in Fairy Creek right now, we amplify it through our social media because we'll have more channels than they will have. So that's some of the work that I would say but big groups try and do to support local based movements.
Yeah, so there's a real important dynamic there where both the larger, more national or even international groups need the frontline people and vice versa. But the Sierra Club and the coal thing is very interesting because this book is about the anti-pipeline controversies. There's another huge case that actually preceded it in the United States where the Sierra Club essentially ran a campaign that ended up prohibiting the construction of new coal plants in that country. It was enormously effective, and it was built around the same kind of logic as the anti-pipeline campaigns that we've seen a bit more recently.
Thanks to both of you for offering your thoughts on that. I now want to shift to a couple of questions, and I might just roll them together. They both have to do with how individuals might practically support movement. In one case toward net zero, and we also have a question about that kind of frames it as Budget 2021 committed to develop and integrate a climate lens so that climate considerations are included in all government decision-making processes. What would be your key advice on how to communicate climate considerations for all decision points within government? That includes health, infrastructure, security, agriculture, etc. So some questions about putting these types of commitments into action. Who would like to start us off?
I'll start on some of that. On the individual's question, what can individuals help with how to help with net zero movement? Is that what they said? That's a funny question. I didn't know there was a net zero movement. But I think I would answer the same way I answer all of the what can I do individual questions that I get, which is that we need to think of ourselves not just as consumers, but as citizens. And that means elected decision makers work for us. And the moment we're on climate change is that every ton of carbon matters, every action matters. So yes, you should change your lifestyle, you should walk to work, you should, do all the things that can reduce your own carbon footprint. But more important than lifestyle change is laws and regulations right now that can change the systems that we have. And so as an individual, I encourage people to call their MPs, their MLAs, to write to their MPs, their MLAs. If you're too shy to do that, join an environmental group out there, Stand.Earth, there are many others, Dogwood, Sierra Club, David Suzuki Foundation, Greenpeace. They all have climate campaigns, and you can send a petition or a letter to your elected official. They need to know that this is an ongoing priority. And then they will continue to prioritize climate ambition through our legislation, our laws and policies. And on the budget considerations, I think that's great. I think we do need a climate lens in all departments, not just in one department. And I think what a climate lens means is that we have to prioritize any spend that is going to reduce either the production of fossil fuels or the emissions from fossil fuels. So demand and supply, not just demand. And prioritize any infrastructure and proposals that are going to build out the future that we need. So electrification and transmission lines, etc. In the budgeting for health and cities and a lot of those departments, we have to use the adaptation science that we have. We know what likely scenarios are. And in fact, most of that data has only been wrong because it's actually been a little bit too conservative. It's actually what's happening today with the heat domes that we've experienced here in BC and the fires, et cetera, it's actually worse than what we expected and quicker globally. So we kind of know what to expect and we're not planning for it. So we need to prioritize money to keep people safe and to plan for what's going to be happening in the next couple of years, which will be more fires and extreme weather, because this is no longer a conversation about whether or not what will happen in the future. It's already happening now. So we need money put towards adaptation so Canadians can stay safe.
I don't have much to add to that. That was a very good answer. I just looked at where the questions came from. I just want to say hi, Joanna. Hi, Nathan. It's so great to see ex-students in the Q&A here. And the literature does unequivocally say that if you as an individual want to have the biggest impact on climate action, it's get involved politically. Vote, organize. It makes a much bigger difference than your choice of car or diet.
Thanks for that, George. And we have a couple other questions here that have to do with solutions and moving toward implementation. But I just want to touch on a question that had to do with the role of our governments and electoral cycles. The comment says, thanks for this great conversation. One of the barriers to taking stronger political action seems to be a failure to imagine possible futures that are different from the present. It doesn't help that our electoral cycles are so short. Politicians often treat the future as someone else's problem. What do you think are the most promising strategies for encouraging political leaders and the rest of us to reimagine the future and lay out pathways to get there?
That's a really powerful question. Among the things that I think would be very useful for that are the sort of deeper public engagement processes that I talk about in chapter 11 of the book. If you want to begin to make progress on these things, stop talking about individual projects and start talking about the kind of future you want and the pathways to get there. And when you begin visioning that as a society, so if you get, there's different ways to do that. And the UK has had a very innovative approach to broad national planning around energy and climate things, where they've had a series of regional workshops and brought lots of different kinds of people in and fed lots of extremely useful, user-friendly expert information into it. And you can actually get a lot of agreement about the bigger picture. That doesn't eliminate the concerns that many people have if you want to build something in their backyard. But it makes it easier for people to accept things if they see, for example, that it's being done for a broader purpose and that they get some kind of local benefit out of it. I realize I'm answering another question here. I've gone to answering Kristen's question from answering Carol's question. But one of the things that the literature about social acceptance of infrastructure suggests is if the local communities aren't involved in decisions about it and don't feel involved in decisions about it, and if they don't actually benefit from it, they're going to be much more likely to be opposed. So you need a model of infrastructure development and siting that both meaningfully involves and benefits local communities. Sephora, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, two things. All of our governments, hundreds of over 100 governments committed under the Paris Agreement to do communication strategies that were funded with their citizens in order to create support for climate action. And we rarely see this. There's a couple of countries that are actually doing it fairly well. And I barely see it in Canada. So I think we actually really need to push our governments to communicate what's possible, and not just to communicate both the threat and the opportunity. For over a decade, we all saw commercials from our government about how our economy would collapse if we didn't expand oil and gas, and how keeping our roads paved and our hospitals open was only going to happen if we built more pipelines. And even over the past couple of years, the Trudeau government has been running ads about how essential and important Trans Mountain is. In fact, even connecting that to the future of clean energy, we need Trans Mountain, which I think is absolutely absurd. But imagine if we had those advertisements about how exciting it's going to be, if we can, have solar panels on all of our houses, and it's going to reduce your costs, how you never have to go to a gas station again if you have an electric car, or even ads about how if you have an electric car, you barely need to ever get it fixed in its whole lifetime, because electric engines don't have the same problems as combustion engines, like breaking down. There are lots of benefits to the renewable energy and electrification economy, and we're not talking about them enough. And I also think specific model projects, if we could push governments to do model projects where people could see what the future looks like. It's cleaner, it's safer, less people die from asthma. There's all of those things, right? And it's like George Bush who had solar panels on the White House? George Bush took panels off the White House. Jimmy Carter had solar panels on the White House. Imagine if those solar panels had stayed from the 1970s, like that kind of thing. Our government saying, you know what, all of the buses are going to be electric. All of the federal vehicles are going to be electric. We're going to have solar panels right on the Parliament building. We're going to make the Parliament building fossil fuel free. Those are the kind of things people need to see that happening to know that it's possible.
Thanks for those comments, Sephora. And I know we have many amazing and insightful questions flowing in, but we are arriving near to the end of our time together today. So hopefully there can be some follow-up conversations coming out of this book launch. But I wanted to pose one last question to end on a hopeful note. So this question is specifically to Sephora and George, if you want to offer any closing words, please feel free as well. So Sephora, you've spent much of your career fighting climate change. Given how daunting the challenge is, what makes you hopeful?
These movements make me hopeful. I mean, it's what's kept me going, honestly. In the last decade or so, reading climate science is tough. Well, facing every day I call it looking into the sun, facing every day what we're experiencing, the climate emergency. It's hard to get up every day and do that. But I have just been so inspired every time I get on the ground with one of these movements. I mean, marching in Montreal, where there was 30,000 people, union leaders arm in arm with local community leaders, and they were like, chanting against the energy pipeline, and they were, they're organizing buses of people, and it's all these people taking the time to actually stand up and organize together and learn from each other. And that makes me really hopeful. And the youth movement makes me really hopeful. I saw a question go by about the youth movement impact in 2019. I think it's been massive, because there's a moral authority in the youth movement saying, well, you're fumbling the ball, adults. Like, how can you possibly just keep, Greta yesterday or the day before saying blah, blah, blah. That was her comment about what she's hearing about the commitments around net zero, et cetera. And she's right. We're just going in this same waffly conversation. And meanwhile, emissions are not going down. They're not going down in Canada, and they're not going down globally. And right now we're living at this moment in history where every ton of carbon matters. Every ton of carbon will save lives that we don't emit. And so it is, the youth give me hope. But I think what's really important for everybody to think about is that hope isn't something you have. Hope is something you create. And I think that I have hope because I organize. And I think that really is the antidote to despair, to being surrounded by people who have a common purpose, who care, who are willing to stand up and say, no, that is not the future I want, and I'm going to fight for the future I want. And right now, in whatever way that people feel called to do it, we need all hands on deck. And so really it is the organizing that gives me hope.
Yeah, and I just, that's I think a really perfect answer. And among the wonderful things about writing this book are learning about so many people who have invested so much time and energy in leaning against the fossil fuel future and really changing things. We actually do have a lot of momentum now. We need to continue pressure and increase pressure to make sure governments know that the kind of change that science says that we need to do to ensure a safe planet it's really rapid change. And that's why I'm actually trying to get people to think more about this process crisis as well, because if we don't actually get much better at figuring out how to make decisions together and move forward in building new clean infrastructure, it's going to be hard to do all this. But until we, that's kind of a separate problem to making sure governments know they need to drive emissions down as quickly as possible. And the best way to do that is to help with the organizations that have been rising up and working so hard on this.
With that, thank you so much, George and Sephora, for engaging us in this insightful and indeed critical conversation today. There's certainly much to consider in the resistance dilemma and important questions to consider around process, values, and the imperatives of the climate crisis to grapple with. So thank you for that. Personally, our discussion today has both challenged me, and I'm glad to say that it's offered me hope that there are indeed practical and actionable ways to help shape a just and sustainable future. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone who joined today's book launch. If you would like to purchase The Resistance Dilemma, Place-Based Movements and the Climate Crisis, you can buy it online or order it through your favorite local bookstore, including the UBC bookstore, and there it is. So hurry to get your copy. Thanks so much for joining us today, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations, George.
Thank you very much.